Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Here's a question. You like candidate endorsements? Do they do anything for you? How about newspapers endorsing candidates? Do they help change your mind? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that with someone who knows a lot about it. Matt Hall is the editorial and opinion director of the San Diego Union-Tribune. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Happy to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Great to talk with you. And Matt, you are also the national president of the Society of Professional Journalists. And I should say at this point, that's an organization for which I previously worked. But your perspective on both accounts is very valuable here. So here in the region, the Spokesman-Review newspaper recently had a somewhat controversial editorial endorsement for Donald Trump and Governor Jay Inslee. We're going to get to that in a moment. But first, Matt, I want to get your perspective and maybe ask you to help convince me of something. Let's pretend like you've seen people like at a protest or in a public park with a sign that says something controversial, like "We didn't land on the moon." Change my mind. So in that respect, newspaper editorials and endorsements of candidates in 2020 serve no functional purpose. Change my mind.
Happy to try to do that. Yeah, I think you're seeing far fewer presidential election endorsements at major American newspapers. I think there were, at last count on Sunday, 44 had endorsed Biden, 4 had endorsed Trump. And that's down from 2008, where I think you had in the mid-90s of the top 100 newspapers had made an endorsement. So fewer endorsements are out there. You got to ask yourself why. Partly that's a business decision. The country is so divided that you're going to alienate half your audience based on your decision. So what I try to tell people is that it's not so much about the name, the end result, it's about the process. And at the Union-Tribune, we are very upfront and transparent about our process, and we involve our audience, right? So what an endorsement says and why I think they're so important is that it's a historical record. You can look back, as we did in 2016, and find out that the Union-Tribune in its then 148-year history had never endorsed a Democrat for president. So when we endorsed Hillary Clinton at the time, we wanted our audience to know that we had done that research, that we were sharing our views, and we did. And we set ourselves up to not just have people judge the choice, but to judge us. And I think in this day and age, when trust in media institutions is falling and readership is declining, that we really need to involve our audience. And so that has been important to us. We ask what kind of questions we should ask our candidates. And it's not so much the presidential endorsement that drives the needle, that moves the needle. It is all the other endorsements down ballot. In San Diego, no one else goes through the interview process that we do. We interviewed candidates and shared our full interviews with our audience. In the primary, it was then transcripts and full audio of our interviews. And in the general, we shared our complete Zoom interviews. So then it's not so much about here's the name, it's here's the process that we went through. Judge us on the process as we're judging the candidate on their records. And I think that's the important thing is it's up to us to say, we're going to bring you along in this. We're going to share everything that we go through. And ultimately, you can judge not only our decision, but us. So you can see how we're asking our questions, if the questions are leading, if they do make a difference. And clearly they do, because in San Diego, you can look at our analytics and come, September and October, our endorsements are always at the top of what our audience is looking at, both our endorsement page and our individual endorsements. And I will say specifically, this may be the case where you are too, is the judges' races, which get so little attention, but are so important because you or I could be walking down a street and get arrested and have to go in front of a judge on any given day. Who is sitting in that chair matters. And so when we interview those judges, those specific Q&As are always the top of our readership. And now, since we're all talking about digital subscribers and subscribers, they drive subscription. So I would counter your question by saying endorsements matter a ton at a local level, and they matter some at a presidential level.
That is a convincing argument. I will say that if only all newspapers and media outlets that did endorsements followed that very robust process, I think we'd be in a better position. I think the backlash, if that's the right word for it, is that the endorsements can come off as confusing. So if newspaper candidate endorsements in some way contributes to the idea that journalists are not a credible or an unbiased news source, why continue doing them?
Well, I think it becomes a media literacy question, and this is a failing of journalism going back decades. journalists did a very, very poor job, if they even tried, to explain what an editorial is, what a letter to the editor is, what a commentary is, what the standards for our unbiased newsroom are. And so at the Union-Tribune, we have a microsite that says Our Journalism Explained, that talks about some of those differences and those distinctions, especially between opinion and news. It talks about how we use anonymous sources. It really tries to pull back the curtain, which I think all journalism outlets need to do. And it's like, I think we personally can do a better job of this, but you need to explain what an editorial board is. The beauty of an editorial board is that it is different from the newsroom. The journalists in the newsroom were not involved in our discussions or our decision-making, weren't even involved in our interviews. And so it is entirely a group of 6 people who meet every day to write editorials and start a conversation or continue a conversation. At my shop, it's not ending a conversation. We will print your letter to the editor if you disagree with our endorsements. That's part of the process too. But I think explaining who the board is, what the board does, and why the board does it is super, super important, which, to bring it back to your newspaper, that is not a board. That's one person. That sounds like a column, not an editorial or an endorsement. And I think the failing there, and what you're seeing is the backlash, if I've been paying a little attention to it, is that was the publisher sharing the publisher's views. There's no board about that. A board connotes multiple people. And I think the beauty there is you're reaching a consensus. You have people who see the world differently, who hopefully you have diversity in that room of gender and geography and race and ethnicity, who then can have a deliberate discussion over days in some cases to reach a conclusion, and then explain that in your editorial. Like, we walk through our process. So in the primary, we endorsed Pete Buttigieg for president, almost gave that nod to Amy Klobuchar, and we explained why we did that and what our thinking was. And then when Pete dropped out a few days before the California primary, we switched gears and quickly rolled out an endorsement for the other moderate in the race, Joe Biden, who we then endorsed in the general election fairly early on. But I do think there's a beauty to a board. I think the failing with journalism, and I'll own some of that too, is that we don't explain enough or as well as we should to our readers what that board is and does.
The board is the issue, or the lack thereof. In this case, I think what people responded to, not necessarily the content of the endorsement, although that was somewhat controversial as well. They started with the line that President Trump is a bully and a bigot and has divided us as a nation, but you should still vote for him. So I think that got a lot of laugh lines, frankly. And then they also went on to endorse Governor Jay Inslee, a Democrat who's basically as anti-Trump as they come, for a 3rd term as governor. Paradoxical, if to say the least. However, what I took issue with, and I'll be upfront, I said on Twitter that I thought this was sort of absurd, and I sort of chided the Spokesman-Review for this on Twitter, was basically, it was the opinion of, like you said, one person, the very wealthy owner, Stacey Coles, and the publisher. So he is the editorial board, and I'm using air quotes intentionally right there. That is not a board. That is one person, like you said. It's a column, but that doesn't seem to be made very well clear in the endorsement. There is some verbiage to that effect, but the endorsement also uses the term we, the royal we. We endorse Donald Trump. Who is we if it's only one person? So that's what part of, I think, the issue and the confusion is, like you were saying, that readers end up thinking that this is the entire newspaper and its journalists thinking that it is, the position, and therefore all the journalists are carrying water for a particular candidate. So coming back to what you were saying earlier, what do you think an organization like the Spokesman-Review, or journalists and newspapers in general, should be doing to make that more clear?
Well, it sounds like the decision was made yesterday to stop doing editorials and endorsements, which I think is the wrong decision. I think that, again, it comes back to media literacy. I think that one of the failures at the Spokesman-Review was using was calling itself a board when it's really the publisher, right? So clearly there's a long history in American journalism of the publisher being able to say whatever they want. That's the publisher's newspaper. That's literally why some publishers own the newspaper. I'm very fortunate at the Union-Tribune to be owned by Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, who owns the Union-Tribune and the LA Times, and is fairly hands-off with our process. This year, we explained that he was involved. He wanted to see some of the editorials that we wrote on a state and national level, and we explained that. to our readers. And I think part of the process is explaining how these discussions unfold. It sounds like the Spokesman-Review didn't do that, lost some trust, maybe lost more trust because of the process. But I do think not doing editorials and endorsements is the wrong way to approach it. I think, as I suggested earlier, that there's a value to a historic record of a community's, values at the time. Of course, it's only one measurement, an editorial board at that juncture, working with those the people on the board. But think about it, if life without that. It's one thing to have a bunch of newspaper stories. That's well and good, but there is a value that you cannot convey in a newspaper story that's unbiased about like the heart of the matter. And it's one thing to say this person did this and this person said this. It's another to say this is the worst real estate deal in city history, or this was a difficult decision for our board. Both of these candidates would be great potential, mayors, city council members, school board members, whatever. Or this race is it's such an easy call, you all should vote for this person. And what we do is we say, this is not our way or the highway. It's not the end of the discussion. Let's talk about it. But here are what this community might consider as value. And when you have as you are with your Trump endorsement, you're talking about what matters. Does an endorsement for a bigot, should that be something that a community should stand for? I mean, racism, there's a lot of both sidesism in journalism. I think we should all agree that racism, there's no second side to racism. Racism is horrible, full stop, and should not be tolerated in any fashion. So, I think editorial boards can and do say that. And if they do it responsibly, there's a smart conversation to be had about the values of a community.
Matt, I appreciate your perspective immensely. This has been a fantastic conversation, and thank you for sharing and helping to inform not only me, but the viewers out there. Thank you so much, Matt Hall.
I appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation too.
Matt Hall is the editorial and opinion director of the San Diego Union-Tribune and the national president of the Society of Professional Journalists. For more on press freedom and the SPJ Code of Ethics, see their website at spj.org. And for more Northwest news, come to our website, NWPB.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.